So welcome. If you are here for the biggest climate bill since ever, now what? You are in the right spot. If you are here for US versus China, that's next door. And I believe there's also a gun violence presentation going on 2 doors down. But if you are here to talk about the awesomeness and the suckiness and the everythingest of the Inflation Reduction Act, you are in the right place. For people who don't already know me, I'm R.L. Miller, and we're having last-minute substitutions, and I'm gonna be muddling through a little bit, but this gentleman here is, so we've got Juan, and we've got Ben Beachy from the Blue-Green Alliance, and Representative Sean Casten. So yeah, let's go ahead and get started. And I know we're still waiting for people to filter in. Please take a seat. Check your hangovers at the door. So this is the place for climate nerdiness. And I'm going to go ahead and get started with an exercise that I developed in California in 2018, trying to organize through my own post-traumatic syndrome. Yes, it's real. And I'm going to ask you to first raise your hand if you're from Paradise, California, the town that was destroyed by a wildfire in November of 2018. And nobody raises their hand, that's okay. Now raise your hand if you've been directly affected by any of the climate crises that have hit our country over the last few years, whether it's wildfire or hurricanes, or whether you've been coughing and choking from the air quality. Keep your hands up. Now, raise your hand if you simply know somebody who has been affected. Look around this room, people. Look around. This is not one dot on a map. This is a country and a world that is being hit hard by the climate crisis. This is not isolated incidents. This is our lives now. And for anybody who's been choking or sweltering, welcome to the coldest summer of the rest of your lives. So we have here, in alphabetical order, we have Ben Beachy from the Blue-Green Alliance. Raise your hand. We have Representative Sean Casten, representing parts of Chicago suburbs. And we have Juan Zhongcheng, representing the Climate Justice Alliance and the Michigan, Environmental Justice Coalition. So thank you to all of our panelists for being here, and each of them will give a little bit more intro. And by the way, since Congressman Casten is here as an official representative, he can't say this, but I can. Follow him on Twitter at Sean Casten when he geeks out on energy, and he does these amazing Twitter threads, and it's seancasten.com. Like I say, he can't say this. Ben Beachy is the Industrial Policy Director at the Blue-Green Alliance, and I'm going to ask you to explain industrial policy because this is one of the things about the Inflation Reduction Act that I think most people don't really understand. As I say, Sean Casten ran for Congress as a clean energy entrepreneur, where I'm pleased to say that Climate Hawks Vote was the only national group to back him in his very first primary back in 2018. And Juan is a queer immigrant of Chinese and indigenous Peruvian ancestry based in Detroit, Climate Justice Director at the Michigan Environmental Justice Coalition and Climate Justice Alliance Policy Working Group co-chair. In other words, we've got a lot of nerd power in this room. And for anybody who doesn't already know me, who hasn't been to the Climate Caucus or the California Caucus, I'm R.L. Miller. I founded a group called Climate Hawks Vote to build political power for the climate movement, which means in plain English that we try to get people like Representative Casten elected. And I'm also on the Democratic National Committee, so if you want to go tell me that the DNC sucks and it's horrible, here I am, I'm your target. Take it out on me. I decided to found this panel, I decided to submit this panel because, first off, I think we need to have this conversation. And just to get one thing out of the way, if you're looking to hear about drug prices or insulin or anything like that, I'm sorry, we're going to be talking about only the climate parts of this. Quick show of hands, who here paid a lot of attention to the negotiations that went on for over a year with Build Back Better, the bill that eventually became, yeah. We all did. Who knows all of the, 104 different programs that are in the bill? Yeah. And this is normal, by the way. I've found, as I've been talking to people about it for the last nearly 2 years by now, that we all followed its tortuous path to becoming law. And I do mean tortuous. But polls show that most of us, including most hardcore committed Democratic voters, don't really know what's in the bill. It's a line in Joe Biden's stump speech. We passed the biggest climate bill since ever. And there's no follow-up on the details. Last year, for my ballot voter guide, I did a survey of all 5,000 plus Democratic candidates running at the state legislative level, and nobody was campaigning on the Inflation Reduction Act. And I'm hoping that that's going to change. And because this is Netroots, there's going to be some controversy. And I set up this panel knowing that not everybody here is going to agree with everything in this bill or each other. And that's okay, because we're Netroots, and we can handle it. And I'm going to start with Representative Kasten. I'm going to ask you to tell us a little bit about the bill, about your work on the bill, and what happens next.
Thank you so much, RL, and thanks to everybody for being here. So I guess I'd start by saying that I said this at an event after we signed all the bill, that I think one of the challenges that we have as Democrats, but more broadly as progressives, is we tend not to celebrate until we've achieved everything. You know, women used to make 70 cents on the dollar. They make 83 now. Yay! Let's have a party, right? Like we don't really do that. And I think for the IRA, it's important for us to say this is a massive dance in the end zone moment. And we can dance in the end zone and celebrate while still acknowledging that we shouldn't pop the champagne yet because we got another quarter to play. And we need 2 interceptions in order to win the game. We are on a path to reduce U.S. CO2 emissions by 40%. That is the biggest climate bill that has ever been passed by any government anywhere. That is a big fucking deal. It's also 60% less than what we need, right? And so we got to keep going forward. And to understand where we go from here, I think you've got to understand how we got to this point. When I came in, thanks to the help of RL and others in 2018, got appointed to the Climate Committee. And the Climate Committee, I believe for the first time in the history of Congress, actually set out to ask a bunch of scientists to say, score our work, is what we are recommending scientifically necessary? And what they said was that the report that came out of the Climate Committee delivered 80% of the CO2 reductions that are scientifically necessary. And that's not because we were lazy, and frankly, it's because there are things we didn't know how to score. But that was the sum of our best ideas. That became the guts of Build Back Better, and that went to the Senate. And the reason why we have a 40% reduction and the Climate Committee recommended a set of policies that got to 80 is because the Senate still believes, in the wake of Vermont floods, bleaching coral in Florida, massive heat waves, fires in Canada, that the single most important thing to protect on this planet is the filibuster. Because the Senate wanted to protect the filibuster, we could not make policy changes in the IRA because the parliamentarian says policy changes do not directly affect budgets, and under the Byrd rule, you can't only budgets are exempted, well, budgets and Supreme Court judges are exempted from the 60-vote threshold in the Senate. So we made a whole series of tax changes, but we didn't make the policy changes. And most of what's left, we know how to do them, but they're policy-related issues. Before I go to what has to be done, I think there's a couple sort of framings that I think were really critical from what came out of the Climate Committee, intellectual framings to better understand why the IRA is so much more successful than past bills. The first was, I think we have finally got to a recognition that clean energy is cheap energy. If you build a solar panel on your roof, you never go to sleep at night and say, I wonder if the price of power tomorrow is going to be high enough for me to justify running my power plant tomorrow. Everybody who owns a coal plant has to ask that question every night. Everybody who owns a gas plant, an oil plant, has to ask that question every night. If you own an electric vehicle, you don't wake up in the morning and say, I wonder if the price of gasoline justifies me driving my electric vehicle. If you insulate your home, you don't say, my goodness, the price of gas has fallen so much, I shouldn't insulate my home anymore. It's cheaper. So unlike a lot of past environmental bills, this was basically about creating the incentives for capital deployment, because we realized once the capital is deployed, the other stuff can't compete. So that was number one. Number two was expanding the definition of environmental justice communities to include those communities that are going to be displaced in a transition away from fossil fuel. Because if we don't get those folks to buy in on the transition, we have a huge political fight. And when you hear people saying, why are we doing ribbon cuttings in the districts of people who voted against the bill, it's because we are all Americans, right? And we've got to get all Americans on board, and that was important. And lastly, that it is much longer on carrots than sticks. And the single best proof of how much that matters is that when I was at the COP in Egypt last year, we sat down with the Secretary General of the UN and the President of Egypt, and the first comment out of their mouth was, we don't like the IRA because it's sucking capital out of the developing world and everybody's now investing in the United States. That is a really big deal, right? And we did it right. Now, the challenge on the policy side is that in order to deploy that, we have basically three barriers. Number one is labor markets. Between CHIPS, the IRA, the infrastructure bill, we're massively prioritizing domestic manufacturing. We're sitting at 3.5% unemployment. Every month since Joe Biden has been elected, we have created more jobs than workers. And that is a sea change. For the 30 years prior to 2017, we always had more workers than jobs. That's great if you're a worker. It means you've got negotiating leverage. We're seeing wages increase. But if we don't find a way to address immigration reform, criminal justice reform to get folks into the workforce, child care, to give more women the opportunity to work, and woke men, it's going to be a challenge. So we've got to address labor market. It's a policy issue. We have to address industrial policy. We were talking at the start that having decided for 30 years that as long as things are cheap, we will look the other way if we're hollowing out the middle class, if we're buying from countries that don't conform to US labor practices or environmental practices. We're now moving away from that, which is great, but and I'm not saying we Congress, I'm saying we Americans, have to have some hard conversations about if we liked cheap stuff that caused all sorts of collateral damage, are we willing to address the collateral damage if it means that stuff might not be as cheap? And I think that's a hard national conversation that we need to have. There are some policy tools to do that. And then the last one, and this is where sort of I've been spending most of my focus with fellow climate hawk Mike Levin, is on transmission. We need to, in any given year in the United States, we build 10 to 100 times as many miles of natural gas pipeline as we build high voltage electricity. If we are going to electrify loads and put electricity demand in places where there isn't currently electricity, like for instance at gas stations, if we're going to build generation in places where you can't readily move the fuel to where you've got an existing interconnect, like you can with gas or with coal, but where the wind is, where the sun is, where the geothermal is, et cetera, then we're going to have to build a lot more wires. And the estimates we have is that we probably have to build transmission at 3 to 5 times the rate we have ever built transmission in this country. That gets framed as a permitting issue, but and Mike Levin and I are working on a bill that I think is on a good trajectory to not only become the Democratic permitting package, but I think we may have some interesting leverage opportunities, even with some of the morons currently in charge of the House, to bring that forward. But you've basically got to understand that to get transmission built, you have to address 3 Ps in order. The first is you have to fix the profit incentives, because transmission, unlike gas, unlike other fossil fuels, the people who have the authority to decide whether a transmission wire gets built have an economic disincentive to build that wire. And if we don't fix the profit incentives, which is a policy problem, we'll never get it built. Once we fix the profit incentives, now we have to address participation. Make sure that the communities that are affected by these wires, not just where the generation is produced, not just where the load is, but the folks in between, that they have voices and participation in that process. If you address profits and participation, permitting is pretty easy. If you don't address profits and participation, permitting becomes, you're never getting to the root cause. And so what Mike and I are doing, I've got a bill to go through and do this. Happy to talk about that in the Q&A, but I think that's really going to be key to going forward. And like I said, cautiously optimistic, we might find a way, even this term, later in the term, to bring that forward, and watch this space.
Awesome, thank you. I'm going to ask Juan, what's wrong with the Inflation Reduction Act?
Thank you, Ariel, for having me, and thank you, everyone, for coming. I think from an environmental justice perspective and from a climate justice perspective, what we're asking around the IRA is who is suffering the burdens of climate issues and who is benefiting from some of the incentives and the tax credits in the IRA. To me, it's pretty clear that a lot of the tax credits are going to basically the wind and solar industry, which is great. We need wind and solar. We need renewable energy to, stave off some of the worst parts of the climate crises. But we're also forgetting about the people who have suffered most of the burdens. Right now, I live in Detroit, and a couple of weeks ago, the wildfires in Canada had some of the worst, created some of the worst air quality days in Chicago, in Detroit, in New York City, all the way to Washington, D.C. And I think that is something that EJ communities deal with on a daily basis. If you live next to an oil refinery, if you live next to a power plant, you will be suffering from respiratory issues. You will be suffering from contaminated soil, contaminated water. I think what EJ communities have been desperately asking for so long is that the government creates policies that will address our issues first and foremost. What we see a lot of times is that there's an economic case being prioritized over the case of like health, over the case of justice. And I think the biggest issue for me with the IRA is that, well, it doesn't go far enough. Fossil fuels are truly, truly the cause, the root cause of environmental injustice, the root cause of climate injustice. And it's really disappointing to see that at the same time that we're incentivizing wind and solar, we're also incentivizing oil and gas production. The United States is poised to become a net exporter of oil and gas. So we're really pushing a lot of the burdens into communities of color here in the United States, but also around the globe. The global South will have to suffer a lot of the burdens of all the oil and gas that we keep pumping out of the ground, that we keep exporting. And not only that, that now we also are trying to kind of greenwash that by saying, oh, we should use some emerging technologies such as carbon capture and hydrogen. These two technologies are actually enabling more fossil fuel production. It's enabling business as usual. It's enabling Shell and Nexen to get really happy about potential new markets. We're at a point where we cannot afford to keep pumping oil from the ground. We're really at a point where people are suffering, and we see that more and more with wildfires, with flooding. And I think for me, EJ communities, communities of color, we have been the canary in the coal mine. We've been saying this for so long. Now that the crisis is intensifying, other communities are going to see that, like working class communities, white communities, and we're in the Great Lakes, region, and we're gonna see an influx of people moving here because of how difficult it's becoming to live in other parts of the United States. So for me, the IRA, through the Climate Justice Alliance, we released a brief talking about the good, the bad, and the ugly. I don't want to say that everything is all bad and terrible, but I think that there is a lot more than we can do, and we got to start looking at the root cause and the root issue, and that is really phasing out fossil fuels. We cannot leave it up to the market to basically decide whether we should build renewables or not. We really need a strong public power option so that renewables can be widespread throughout all communities, and like the congressman said, we really need to prioritize participation of those communities that have been impacted the most. Thank you.
Thank you. And before I ask Ben to talk about implementation, I'm just going to give you guys a very brief anecdote. When I first started blogging on Daily Kos way back in the day, one of the sharpest writers on the site, a guy known as Meteor Blades, was always talking about industrial policy and how important it was that the United States should have an industrial policy. And we didn't. And for 40 years, our industrial policy has been that we come up with really smart ideas, and then we export the ability to build those ideas to China. And we export the jobs to China. And then we look around at the Midwest and we go, what the hell happened to our country? And that's not a good industrial policy. And that has changed. And at this point, I'm going to ask Ben to talk about industrial policy and implementation of the Inflation Reduction Act, because so far, no money has started to go out. And let's fix that.
Thank you. Good morning, everyone. Good to be with you. So my name is Ben, and thanks to RL for organizing this panel. And I work with the Blue-Green Alliance. If you're not familiar with the Blue-Green Alliance, it's a national coalition of unions and environmental organizations. And the work we do is we work to unite unions, environmental organizations, and other allies in fighting for solutions that are really win-win, that allow us to push for a livable climate and good union jobs and a fair economy that redresses long-standing injustices at the same time. We don't believe any one of those three pillars of climate, jobs, and justice can be ignored. We only pursue solutions that reach all three. And when it comes to the Inflation Reduction Act, as we've heard this morning, as Juan laid out, it is a very complicated bill. There are 104 programs just in the climate and energy section of the Inflation Reduction Act. And I think it is also true that there are some opportunities to fight for climate, jobs, and justice, to organize, that are embedded in the text of the bill, that many people in this room and many people across the country fought for years, long before it was called the Inflation Reduction Act, long before it was even called Build Back Better. And it is really testament to the organizing power of many across the nation that we're even having this conversation today. I'm going to zoom in on one specific element of this potential for win-win-win on climate, jobs, and justice, and that is in what it means for industrial policy, what it means for the manufacturing sector specifically. As we build the growing clean energy economy, we're right now at an inflection point. We face a pretty clear choice. We can continue doing as we've done, as Representative Caston named, which is hitching our climate goals to overseas supply chains that are largely marred by labor abuses, higher levels of pollution, and shipping bottlenecks. Or we can build our clean energy future on a foundation of good jobs, of a reliable industrial base, of cleaner manufacturing, and greater equity. That choice is ours. And the choice has not been made just because the IRA has passed. We have more work to do. The investments in the Inflation Reduction Act, though, create an opportunity, a fighting chance to do that, build that more just, that cleaner, fairer, and stronger industrial base for our clean energy future. There are more than $50 billion in investments just in clean manufacturing in the bill. There's around like 400 billion, right, in the total climate and energy section. About 50 billion of that is for manufacturing. And those investments, just the manufacturing ones, are projected to create over 900,000 jobs over the next decade. If you take all the climate and energy investments, they're projected to create around 9 million jobs. And that is really important because if we get the targeting of these dollars right, and that's a big if, but we have a shot at doing this. If we get the targeting of those dollars right, that's an opportunity to invest in hard-hit communities that have been hollowed out by decades of divestment and deindustrialization, right? So communities that have been been left behind, been intentionally divested through racist acts like redlining, or that have been subject to the race to the bottom, in which factories pick up and leave and outsource to countries with lower labor and environmental standards. That erosion of manufacturing has meant that workers across the country have lost a primary source of higher paying union jobs. It also means that communities have lost tax revenue, which impacts everything from like health budgets to public schools. And our nation has lost the industrial base that is the backbone of virtually all modern economies. So the IRA is designed to turn the tide. The manufacturing investments are an opportunity to turn the tide here. By creating good manufacturing jobs in the hardest hit communities for the hardest hit workers. And I would put black workers and low-income workers at the top of that list, because black workers have been the ones that have experienced the sharpest losses of manufacturing jobs in the last 30 years. There's kind of like this false caricature of the manufacturing job loss only impacting a white man holding a wrench in Ohio. It's actually that person was probably impacted. And it's also true that black workers have faced a 30% downfall in manufacturing employment since the late 1990s. And that has contributed to both racial and economic inequality. It's only exacerbated the trend lines. So we have an opportunity to try to reverse those trend lines and build a more just economy, and clean manufacturing the widgets of our clean economy is going to be part of that solution. We are starting to see the results already. Within the first 8 months of President Biden's signature on the bill, on the law, we saw investments of around 191 investments announced that are projected to create about 140,000 jobs in clean energy and clean manufacturing across 41 states. That's in the first 8 months, just from company announcements, right? Now we have to get the details right, but that's an early sign that we have some data-backed optimism. So it might be clear, so I just named the opportunity that lies in front of us to support greater economic and racial injustice by targeting those investments to hard-hit communities and workers. But this onshoring of clean manufacturing also is important to support our climate goals. Currently 97% of the wafers that go into all of our solar panels are made in one country, in China. And China also makes 3 out of every 4 electric vehicle batteries. This is not to participate in any way in the nativist China bashing that the Republicans are partaking in. If you want to hear more about a good progressive approach to U.S.-China policy, right next door, they're having that conversation, and I would recommend you talk with Toby, who has been leading the way on how progressives can think about U.S.-China policy. What I'm saying is that it is a very fragile enterprise to have 97% of our supply chains concentrated in any one country, anywhere. That would be as much true for our food security as it is for our clean energy future. The pandemic has taught us a lot about the dangers of such heavy dependency on vulnerable supply chains for essential goods. And that is as true for clean energy as it was for N95 masks. The other thing to note about why it's important to onshore manufacturing of clean energy goods is that there's actually overseas corporations, after they've outsourced their production abroad, tend to emit more, tend to cause more pollution than US factories in making much of the aluminum and steel that go into our clean energy goods. A solar panel is 85% aluminum. Producing the average ton of aluminum in China, which produces the majority of the world's aluminum now, producing the average ton in China causes 65% more climate pollution than in the United States. Now, we can and should and have an opportunity to clean up aluminum production in the United States. We must do that at the same time that we practice that onshoring so that we're not just exporting our climate pollution abroad. To meet our climate goals, we need to invest in cleaner, reliable domestic supply chains for clean energy, and there are opportunities embedded in these investments to do that. There are opportunities to change the game, to finally reverse this untenable status quo, to actually attach clean energy growth to manufacturing job growth while detaching clean energy from vulnerable imports. And RL named industrial policy. This is all an example of a return to industrial policy. People ask, why should we be embracing industrial policy? I think the simple answer is because when pursuing a goal, it is helpful to have a plan. That's my answer.
Bold.
I don't know. We could leave it to corporations to decide what that plan is, or we could, as a collective public, come up with that plan. That is the choice that lies in front of us. One of those options is democratic, and the other is not. One of them is going to help us tackle the climate crisis, and the other is not. One will help us redress longstanding racial and economic injustice, and the other will not. The critique levied against industrial policy is that we're picking winners. I think it should be relatively non-controversial that it makes sense to pick the sectors of the economy that are going to allow us to continue operating on a hospitable planet as winners. We're essentially picking ourselves as winners. So it's a really important return to smart industrial policy, because what we are doing is investing in industries that are strategically imperative, not only for climate action, but for the more just and thriving economy that we all seek. So that is the potential for a win-win-win. I can get into some of the more specific organizing hooks that I see in implementation and Q&A. But that's the potential win-win-win, and those wins, if we achieve them, really, really matter for the workers who are now finally getting some high-paying jobs, for the communities who are seeing long-sought investments for the first time really in decades, and for all of us who seek a livable climate.
Thank you. That was great. And I'm going to throw in a quick plug here for two White House sites. The first one is cleanenergy.gov, and that one will take you to if you scroll down past the solar panels, there will be a little picture of a house, and you can mouse over that to see some of the specific consumer benefits of the Inflation Reduction Act, by which I mean, the heat pump credits and the clean car incentives and the weatherization incentives. And the second one, which goes, I think, more to the points raised by Ben in particular, is invest.gov. And that one shows all of the money that is being invested by the Biden industrial policy, which is really three bills. It's the Inflation Reduction Act, it's the Chips and Science Act, and the thing that we all called the BIF, which is now the Infrastructure and something or another Jobs Act. But as Ben likes to call them, they are now Uncles Biff, Chip, and Ira. Altogether, they're from the Uncle Sam branch of your family, and they're all here to help. And invest.gov will show you all of the money that is being invested in America in things like bridges and roads and such like that. So I just needed to do a quick plug for those two sites, because that's a good way of seeing what's going on in your community. So my first question for all three panelists is going to be talking about, because this is a political space, talking about whether Democrats are running on this and whether they should be and whether this is a winning issue. Now, if you've done any work at all in the clean energy space, you know that solar and wind generally poll like mom and apple pie. But sometimes the implementation gets a little tricky. And as I said before, I did a survey of 5,000 plus state legislators on the Democratic side, and I found that nobody was in 2022 talking about the Inflation Reduction Act on the trail. And so I'm going to ask each of you if you know, one, are people talking about this in Michigan yet? Are these things starting to happen? Representative Kasten, any thoughts that you can answer?
Yeah, so I mean, as you know, RL, when I ran the first time, there were the things the pollster said I should talk about, and they said, all right, your top 3 issues should be bling, 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 and I said, okay, my top 3 issues are climate, climate, and climate, and I won. I also had spent 20 years in the industry, right? So I had a fluency in it, and I'm not saying that makes me special. I'm just saying like it's a, historically, energy policy and environmental policy have not been what gets voters to go to the polls. We can be happy about that, we can be sad about that, it just is what it is. Now, my view is that if you see something that is scientifically necessary and not politically possible, and you decide to defer to what's politically possible, then by definition you are incapable of leadership, right? Like your job is to push.
Welcome to the Republican Party.
Well, no, but let's not make this purely partisan. I think there is. My general view of politics is that losers will always cry louder than winners cheer. If we are transitioning away from fossil fuels and you have a multi-trillion-dollar industry that knows that the construction of a new solar panel, the construction of an electric vehicle manufacturing plant jeopardizes their long-term viability, they will fight very hard and they will make noise and it will become politically difficult to oppose them. If you are going to fight for things that will benefit some future entrepreneur, some as yet unborn person, those constituencies don't exist yet because the winners don't know they're there. And my sense is that what's changing on the ground now is that as we build these facilities, you are seeing a cadre of people who have something to lose by going backwards. And the reason why I say don't frame this as Republican versus Democratic, the conversion to a clean energy economy is the biggest wealth transfer in the history of our species, from energy producers to energy consumers. And the politics are not Republican versus Democratic, except by coincidence that the extractive parts of our country tend to be Republican, and the parts of our economy that create jobs and economic activity, value add, tend to be Democratic. And it is hard to get a Democratic colleague who represents the oil patch to say, if I embrace this policy, all of my voters are at risk of losing their jobs. Now, as against that, I've had some very collaborative conversations with some of my Republican colleagues in Iowa who would love to find ways to get the wind power from Iowa connected into Chicago power markets, right? And so, because now they've got people who have something to lose in their community if we don't push this forward. And so I think it's a winnable message, but I think we need to elevate our reading level and really get into a leadership position to push that out and connect it to people on the ground who are voting in specific areas who have their own understandable self-interest. And whatever we think of, like, yes, people should transition, name one time in our history when an industrial transition has benefited the workers who are being transitioned out, right? The invention of the steam shovel was great, and John Henry's life sucked, right? And we have to acknowledge that and be respectful and not patronizing of those folks who say, why is the government going to look out for me as a coal miner, as an oil derrick worker? I'm not going back to community college at age 55. I don't trust that you're going to look out for me. I think we've got to be respectful of that.
I'm going to ask another question, and this one's going to be, I think, a little spicy. A lot of the controversy around in the Inflation Reduction Act has to do with two aspects in particular. There's a lot of money in the bill for hydrogen in various color shades of hydrogen: gray hydrogen, blue hydrogen, green hydrogen, clean hydrogen, rainbow hydrogen, I don't know. And the second is something called carbon capture and storage, which for many years I simply dismissed as, I too would like to find a pill that would keep me rich and thin and beautiful and eating a chocolate cake every day. You know, magic, unicorn dust kind of stuff. But there's some scientific, there's in fact a consensus at the IPCC that we will need some sort of ability to draw carbon out of the atmosphere if we're going to keep to 1.5 degrees. And so I'm going to ask everybody on this panel, because there is a lot of money, is this a good thing? Is this simply a bribe that needed to be paid to Joe Manchin to get the bill through, and there will be $17 billion that will be flushed down the toilet and do absolutely no good whatsoever? Or is it actively harmful to communities that are being directly affected by this? And I'm going to start with Juan. I understand you may have some thoughts.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, if we think about our current fossil fuel economy and the fossil fuel regime, again, we see that the communities most affected are Black and Brown, Indigenous, poor communities. And these communities are hosting pipelines, they're hosting refineries, they're hosting all the pollution, and they don't get to see the benefits of basically the energy produced by fossil fuels. And we're going to do the same if we continue propping up technologies like carbon capture and hydrogen. What I've seen in the IRA is that a lot of these tax credits are actually going to be used to get natural gas to continue to be produced and labeled as clean. A lot of hydrogen that is being labeled clean hydrogen is actually coming from fracked gas that then is paired up with carbon capture. These technologies, I always hear like, oh, they're like unproven. Well, they're somewhat proven, but not in a good way. They're proven to actually keep keep the fossil fuel industry afloat, and they've also been proven to continue polluting these neighborhoods and these communities. Again, are majority Black, Brown, and Indigenous, and to me, this is just, it's climate insanity. Like, we should be phasing out fossil fuels. We should not be giving them handouts. And imagine if that money that is going to credits for carbon capture and hydrogen was instead going directly to impacted communities to create the future that we want to see. Like I mentioned earlier, there are some potential good opportunities in the IRA. There is money for weatherizing homes, there is money for rooftop solar, but it is not enough. It's not being realized in the way that it could have been. I know Ben was talking about, you know, industrial policy and choosing winners and losers. Which winners are we choosing right now? I think that when we talk about sacrifice zones and communities that will be sacrificed, we're also picking winners and losers. And often the losers look like me, look like people in the global south, look like people with darker skin. And, you know, this is something that our government has a duty to correct through policy, and we're not doing that. Carbon capture and hydrogen are recreating that same issue of picking winners and losers, and all to the benefit of the fossil fuel industry. I still don't understand why we had to do it. I know we keep hearing that this is in order to appease Senator Joe Manchin, but I've heard this administration say multiple times that they are in favor of an all-of-the-above energy policy that includes fossil fuels. So that, to me, when they say that, that is climate insanity, that is hypocrisy. You cannot support renewable energy and fossil fuels at the same time. That is a slap in the face to communities of color.
Ben, you want to take that one on? CCS and hydrogen, helpful, hurtful, or useless?
I actually want to address something that builds on the last two questions.
Okay.
So Juan's point about who is winning, and I think it actually goes back to the political question of like what should we run on. I feel like there's a lot of conversation around the IRA right now about winning the win. First, we have to have some wins to win, right? Like, there's not a single dollar has flowed from the Inflation Reduction Act yet. And so there's both a challenge and an opportunity in front of us. And given that a lot of folks in Netroots are organizers at heart, I think there's a lot of organizing leverage embedded within the Inflation Reduction Act to try to reap some of those wins. And it's not really been talked about a little bit, very much. And so I think it makes sense to elevate it here. And so this is actually like particular to not those two line items, but other line items in the bill that are money going directly to companies. And Juan pointed this out, that like, absent extra effort from folks on the ground, money will just flow to the companies. To actually have that money flowing into the companies translate into local benefits, like I'm talking about I'm talking about to like solar and wind companies as well, right? Or to manufacturers of solar and wind components. We need to have some sort of levers embedded within the rules that are guiding the flow of cash. And really, when we passed the Inflation Reduction Act, when it passed in August last year, it was not the end of the fight by any stretch. There's an anecdote, I don't think it's apocryphal, that when the Dodd-Frank Act passed, on the same day that it passed, there was a Wall Street lobbyist who declared it was halftime in the fight over financial regulation. It is halftime right now in the fight for a more livable climate and more just economy. And the second half is implementation. And when I say implementation, it's a very boring word for a very monumental task. The first part of it is to get the rules right, the rules that are going to be guiding how this money flows, to whom it flows. Does the money actually redress or reinforce historic injustices? The answer to that question is largely going to be decided in specific details that are now being shaped. And a lot of us have been pushing since the day it passed to try to shape those rules, to make sure that the hardest hit communities and workers are the ones at the front of the line to get the investments that are actually desired, the ones that actually would create like good jobs and reductions in local pollution and climate pollution. And let me just name a couple of things that are in those rules. We haven't gotten everything we wanted. But the Biden administration has put out some rules that are basically organizing hooks, basically negotiating leverage for all of us to try to translate that money into real on-the-ground benefits. For example, there are a number of the programs, there's guidance or rules on the money that says we will favor companies applying for this money who work well with unions, who have a unionized workforce. Well, that's negotiating leverage for unions to say, dear company, you want to talk? Like, if you want to position yourself well to be able to access this cash, you might want to talk with us. There are rules that say that you have to, that there'll be a prioritization of investments that actually have legally binding community benefits agreements with local groups on the ground. And if you're not familiar with community benefits agreements, this is something that organizers created. Right? This is something that comes from folks across the country who have successfully organized and built a local coalition of a variety of different stakeholders to negotiate directly with a business and say, if you're going to be doing this project, we need to see some real on-the-ground benefits before we sign off on it. And this is not some sort of like hortatory last-minute box-checking exercise. You're not consulting with us. We are co-designing this project. And there's an opportunity for a lot of groups on the ground to negotiate these community benefits agreements and to try to actually get in those community benefits agreements very tangible like results, right? Like just to pull like from existing community benefits agreements that already exist, you can put in there labor standards that talk about the pay and the standards for workers. But you can also get in there benefits for the local communities, local hire provisions, provisions to prioritize hiring of women and workers of color. Provisions that actually say the business will be dropping money into a community-controlled fund for economic development. All of which are not in some sort of like IOU, nice-to-have checklist, but a legally binding contract between community groups and the business. And a number of the dollars, actually billions of the dollars that are going to be going out the door in the next year, say we will prioritize this money for companies that have signed a legally binding community benefits agreement with local community groups. So that again, it creates negotiating leverage for all of us to approach local businesses who are angling for this cash and be like, you better talk to us. We better see some real benefits on the ground here for our folks. So I want to uplift that because I think some of those organizing hooks have gotten lost in the morass of the complications of this bill, and I think they deserve some ardent work and attention.
Representative Caston, CCS, hydrogen.
CCS and hydrogen are complete boondoggles with one exception that I want to get to for all the reasons that the panelists have talked about. But I think the most important one, and why I am frankly pretty sanguine about this, is that economically only an idiot would build them. And I trust that markets are not idiots. As important as all these issues are, leave them aside. Coal plants in the country today, without CCS on top of them, cannot compete in the marketplace. 15 years ago, coal was 50% of the power in the country. Today, we generate more power from renewables than from coal, not because we are woke, because people like cheap power. The idea that you would take a technology that cannot compete today and say, you know what I'm going to do? I'm going to go to Wall Street. I'm going to ask people to give me money so that I can invest capital in a plant so that I will have a less economic plant because now 20% of my power is going to go to run the carbon recovery. It ain't going to happen. Similar issues with hydrogen. Politically, and I think you used the right word, unicorns, RL, I would frame this as I have colleagues who believe in unicorns. I have colleagues, furthermore, who would love to live in a world where they could go to a restaurant and eat unicorn meat. We provided tax credits for a unicorn meat processing facility. If you believe in unicorns, that made you vote for the bill because you are so excited that you can finally create an industry for all the people clamoring to become unicorn slaughterers in our country. If you know that unicorns aren't real, it costs us zero because unicorns don't actually exist. It's not true to say that the IRA is spending money on CCS. What the IRA is doing is saying, if you can go and find really stupid money to make really stupid investments, we will provide a tax credit to offset some of your stupidity. And by and large, markets aren't doing that. Witness how many CCS plants have never been built. Ask Southern Company about Project Vodal down. Ask in Illinois about FutureGen. They're unicorns. They're not going to happen. Now, the exception on these, and this is the point that I think is important to get to, in the power sector, CCS is not going to matter. In the transportation sector, hydrogen is not going to matter. In the power sector, hydrogen is not going to matter for purely thermodynamic reasons. In the industrial sector, we don't have a way to get to zero carbon as we sit here right now where we know how to displace industries that use fossil fuel not as an energy input but as a chemical input. How do you make steel? How do you run a blast furnace without met coke? How do you make fertilizer without natural gas? How do we feed people? How do we house people without steel, without cement, without fertilizer? And we've got good bills. One of the first bills that I got through and signed into law, amazingly, by Donald Trump, was to create about $1 billion to help decarbonize those hard-to-decarbonize spaces. But if that's an R&D problem, and if we can't get that done, I think there is a need to say in a zero-carbon future, we've got to figure out a way to get the CO2 emissions off of those facilities and not release them into the atmosphere. One of the ways we might get that done and avoid the CO2 in the first place is if we can replace the natural gas inputs to those facilities, the coal inputs to those facilities with hydrogen. And in that scenario, it's now appropriate to think through all of the important distinctions between gray and blue and green hydrogen, and those pieces matter. But it's important to understand that once, the laws of the United States are negotiable, the laws of economics and physics are not negotiable. And once you constrain reality by the laws of physics and economics, you're striking the transportation sector, you're striking the electric sector, and so the size of the problem is just much smaller, and it's not as big a deal. And so there's just this gap when we're all done that, yes, if you ignore physics and economics, CCS and hydrogen are big problems, but the world is not going to. The world's not that stupid. It's just that some of my colleagues are.
And by the way, while doing this, by the way, I was reading through some of Representative Kasten's tweets last night, and I got to put in a plug for this one that starts off with, "You know what I think of Kevin McCarthy? He is a shriveled husk of an intellectually limited, emotionally stunted boy who is incapable of leadership or patriotism, who only got his job because no one else in his caucus had his combination of stupidity and ambition." Fact check, true.
Unfortunately, because of my political job, I had to withhold some of my true feelings.
We're almost out of time, but I want to give everybody a lightning round-ish chance to say two things. Number one, what's next? And number two, what do you want listeners in the audience here to take back to your communities, organizers? What do you want the organizers to organize on? Anyone want to grab it first?
Yeah, I'll get started, and I want to, respectfully push back on Rep. Kasten's. When you said that the IRA is not supporting CCS, actually the 45Q tax credit was increased from $45 to $60 for enhanced oil recovery. So actually using carbon capture to get more oil off the ground. And
that's totally fair. The 45Q is terrible. We didn't have the votes to get rid of it. I take your point.
And what I'm trying to say is, there are a lot of contradictions within the IRA, the BIF, and the CHIPS Act. And I don't want to end this with all the negatives. I think, but I do want to mention that we have to look at the lived experiences of folks on the ground who are going to be impacted by some of these technologies. And there is a lot of funding in the BIF for what are called hydrogen hubs and carbon capture hubs that are going to be deployed around the country. Many corporations and industry are already applying to be getting money from DOE to use some of these experimental technologies. And we know that the communities that are going to be most affected, again, are going to be Black and brown communities. With that said, I want to acknowledge that there is potential in the IRA to do a lot of great things. I want to acknowledge that there are things that could be done much, much better at the implementation level. I think there are a lot of environmental justice groups that are trying to access some of that money to, make our communities whole again. But all of that is going to really be relying upon really making sure that we look at who's getting some of that money. For example, in terms of credits for transportation, there's not going to be benefits for folks that cannot own electric vehicles. A lot of the money in the IRA is going to go to electric vehicle owners. Similarly, a lot of tax credits are going to homeowners. What do we do with folks that are tenants, and that's the majority of people that live in EJ communities too. So I think there is a lot more to be done. And yeah, I'm looking forward to seeing some of the implementation work, but we got to keep pushing for more. We cannot, we are at a crisis point, and we cannot just settle for a half-baked measure, in my opinion. Thanks.
So, Ben, takeaways for communities, and what would you like to see next?
There are $400 billion that will be going out the door, and what we do with them is I think, the question in front of us. And just to pick up on Juan's last point, the history of this law has not yet been written. right? And I think what we do in the next couple of years is what's going to write that history, and determining which communities get the money for which purposes. And just to name, like, there's a real I'll name 3 opportunities that I see for organizers to not only be like passive recipients of funding, but to use some of the organizing opportunities to act as agents of economic transformation on the ground. I think the real opportunity here is yes, to redistribute funding, but more importantly, to redistribute power. And I don't want to overstate that case because I don't know where we're going to be in 10 years. It depends a lot on what happens in the next couple of years. But there's potential. We have a fighting chance, I think, at reclaiming agency on the ground for decisions that impact our communities. 3 opportunities that I see. One, I just named, for funding that goes directly to companies. If it's discretionary funding, that is, the companies have to apply for that funding, there's an opportunity to negotiate community benefits agreements with those companies, to put into legally binding language the very tangible health, economic, and environmental benefits that local community groups want to see on the ground in order for that company to get the funding. That's number one. For number 2, funding that flows to state governments. It depends a lot on your state, but a lot of states right now are working to pass policies that would do one better than what we got done at the federal level. In states where you can actually have the votes to enact stronger equity standards, stronger labor standards, stronger environmental standards than we even got at the federal level. And to say, yeah, we're going to distribute this federal cash, and we're going to layer on top of that distribution these high road labor, equity, and environmental standards to make sure that we are actually doing justice with these dollars. That's a real opportunity. There are campaigns brewing in a number of states, many of you are probably involved in them, to try to get passage of laws at the state level to strengthen the standards. In addition to the standards, sometimes they're strengthening the money. Some states have surpluses to be able to contribute to additional state dollars. So that's a second opportunity, running state campaigns to put on layers of justice in how the funds will flow. The third that I would name is direct access to the funding. There are a few line items, not too many, but there are a few in the law that allow groups to directly apply for funding. I'm sure many of us could talk about those afterwards if folks are interested. There are a select number of line items. There's also a lot of opportunities for individuals to access funding as well, and that's an opportunity to organize, to make sure people are aware that they have funding opportunities available to them. And I think, again, just to restate it, if we get this right, it's a big if, but if we get this right, the opportunity in front of us is not just to reduce climate emissions by X, right? It is to not just to change how we power our economy, but how power is distributed in our economy. I think that should be our North Star.
So I'm going to try to be quick on what's next. Watch this space. As I mentioned, Mike Levin and I are taking the lead on the Democratic permitting package. If we can get everything done, we may have a big press conference next week. It may be into August. But that's going to be key, and watch how that goes. As far as like actions I'd love to see for you all in the broader progressive community, 3 big things. Number 1, we don't pay nearly enough attention to the Federal Energy Regulatory Commission. We have no way to decarbonize our economy without electrifying huge chunks of our load, building a lot of grid. The only agency that has authority over that is FERC. FERC has a 5-member commission, and since Biden has been elected, I think we've only had about 3 months that it has all 5 members there, largely because of the Senate and a certain senator who shall remain nameless. Call him Voldemort if you want. The White House and the Senate needs to hear very loudly, we don't know how long you're going to have Democrats in control. We're delighted you are prioritizing judges, at least in blue states where the blue slip process doesn't back. You have got to prioritize staffing FERC. They need to hear that loud. It makes all of these problems easier. Number 2, one, I think you'd mentioned that we're about to be an oil and gas exporter. We actually already are a net oil and gas exporter. Oil use in the United States is basically flat for the last decade, in spite of the fact that our economy is up by 50%. Coal use is down 40%. Natural gas use is growing, but it's only growing half as fast as GDP. That is huge, and it's a testament to how capital is moving in the United States, but it means that the industry has gone to becoming a net exporter. Now, there's a whole lot of environmental concerns with us drilling holes and exporting, both globally and locally. At the same point, do appreciate that last winter, the price of natural gas in Europe, as high as the price of gas got here, was 10 times as high in Europe. And there would have been mass chaos, political chaos, that Russia would have used their advantage in Europe if it got much higher. It stayed as low as it did, 10 times as high as it was here, in part because U.S. was exporting so much LNG. From a climate perspective, it's troubling how warm the winter was in Europe. From a political perspective, thank goodness it was a warm winter in Europe, or it could have been much worse. And there's a real concern going into this winter what's going to happen. You're going to see a lot of push from the gas industry to export more. And what we've been, in our office, telling everybody from the Secretary of Energy on down is, if we believe, and I'm willing to be convinced, and I'm willing to agree that in the short term, we need to help our allies in Europe not be dependent on Russian gas. If we believe that that is good public policy, it's an entirely separate question to say we should sell it at a profit. Right? Because right now, what the gas industry is doing is playing an arbitrage game where they can sell it for so much more in Europe, which, oh, by the way, means they can also sell it for more here, because if we're not willing to pay the price, they can get it at a port in Lisbon or a port in Rotterdam. They can jack up the price here. And I think putting pressure on our economic and the State Department regulators to say what we need to do diplomatically is one question, but we should not be wartime profiteering. Make that point loudly. The last thing, and I keep coming back to economics because it's where we win. All of the economics is on our side. We can embrace markets on this one and win. I spent this entire last week in press conferences and hearings because the Republicans have decided to make this ESG month. They are bashing ESG investing. Sparks been flying. At one point, one of my colleagues referred to the Republicans as descendants of Leon Trotsky, and one of our Republicans said that was unfair, and Brad Sherman said, "You're right, I've ignored the Eastern versions of communism. You're probably closer to Maoists than Trotskyites." But I say all that because there is today $8.4 trillion of assets under management just in the U.S. of people who have decided to preferentially invest their retirements in ESG funds. That is in large part, it's not solely responsible, but that decision by individuals is helping the solar companies and the battery companies and the electric vehicle companies and the wind companies attract capital. First Solar today is trading at over 100 times multiple of their earnings. ExxonMobil is trading at 7 times earnings. As one of my colleagues at the DOE likes to say, ExxonMobil is not failing to invest in new wells because they are evil people trying to send money to shareholders. They're not investing in new wells because they are bad at business. And the markets are saying, I do not want to give you capital because I don't trust that you can provide, that you are going to meet the needs of future, where the economy is going. And they are giving capital to the solar companies, everybody else that's in there. The reason that matters is that remember what I said before, losers cry louder than winners cheer. There is a massive backlash that is trying to take away the rights of state pension funds, of you as investors, to decide where to allocate your investment dollars. There are dozens of states that have now banned their pension funds from investing, and the groups that are doing that, in many cases, are actively being funded by the banks who are losing money because the banks have an ESG fund and they can't go there anymore. I've met with all the big bank CEOs on this, and I remind them consistently that your desire to not alienate the Republican Party means that you are losing money. And if you need to stiffen your spine, here's how you stiffen your spine. $8.4 trillion. Talk to your local banker. give them, they want to do the right thing, but they are hearing a ton of noise from the Republicans on this, and they're not hearing noise the other way. So the more you can say to the banking community, I am a capitalist, I want to choose how to invest my investment dollars, and how if you take away my options, I'm going to go find a bank that will give me that option because I actually want to participate in our markets. They need to hear you, you need to beat up on them, they can be pushed, but they need the push. So I hope that's helpful.
Okay. I know that we really need to wrap up this panel. In the way of a closing, I usually say when welcoming people to the climate space, abandon all hope. I don't know if we found any hope, but I think we've at least found some solidarity. Thank you all.
Thank you.